Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth episode in my podcast, Our Human Experiences, the podcast where we talk about generational trauma by sharing our genuine human experiences. Today we have with us Amber, aka PossumPrincess, and we will be talking about how growing up, being a child, going from place to place in the Air Force, and growing up surrounded in a very religious background has affected her and how she's grown from this. So, welcome on, Amber.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here.
No, thank you very much for doing this with me. So, we'll get this started. When we first talked, I asked you what your childhood was like. And the first thing you said was that you grew up as an Air Force brat.
Yeah, that really sums it up. I love to open with that. It's something that I like about myself. Is a huge part of my identity because I don't feel like I'm from anywhere, but that's me. That's my background. I'm Air Force brat is very, very much a part of who I am.
And like, what to you makes that like your biggest defining factor of your childhood?
I think a lot of it is it's shaped so much. And it says so much just in that statement. It's very heavily implied. It meant that I moved around a lot growing up, which is absolutely true. It meant that I've seen a lot of places, that I've said goodbye to a lot of places and people. And I was constantly having to adapt to that change all of the time. And I learned how to do that fairly well. Maybe too well in some ways.
Right.
But it was definitely important to me. And I like to imagine sometimes that out in the world, if you bump into somebody and you find out that you're from the same town, for me, it's the same feeling if I bump into somebody who is also a military kid, especially an Air Force brat like me. It's that, I imagine, anyway, it's the same feeling.
Right. And you were saying that like throughout your experience in that you eventually really got grounded in Christianity because it was like one stable community that was like constantly there no matter where you went.
Correct. And I definitely see what my parents were hoping for with that, and can even appreciate it because we moved around so much. One of the first things we did every move was find a church. And especially when I was younger, elementary age, that was really nice to have that grounding. Some of it I had built in, I had some of those generations. So I had built in like grandparents at the church. I didn't live close enough to see my own grandparents on a regular basis, but I had access to people that age who cared about me as a person through church. And that was nice.
Yeah, you had access to other people's grandparents.
Yeah, and they thought I was great, and 6-year-old me was happy for it.
Right. Now, like, obviously growing up in a military setting, like there's a way that parents generally treat their children in that environment, a lot of rules, but also a part of the, Christian community. There's a lot of rules there too. How do you think that has had an effect on you?
Oh my goodness, that's been paramount. Rules as just a general concept in life are super important to me. Every time you move, you want to find out what the new rules are. What do the kids at that school think is popular or interesting? Who's the band here? What's the movie? What's happening? Who are the cool kids? What are the rules? And that's very much prominent in the military community as well as church. So that was just
Really?
a huge part of my life. And learning the rules was a way that I adapted, and I became very good at it.
So yeah, it's really interesting that you've had to like adapt in these different social settings. But on that same topic, you've also had to adapt through a lot of different schooling techniques as well. I mean, you've done public, private, and homeschool, right?
Correct. And I think, honestly, looking back, one of the reasons, and it was in that order, I started out in public school, did a stint in Christian private school, and then I finished my high school education homeschooled, and I enjoyed that the most. Probably because it was actually a chance for me to not have to worry about the rules so much. I got a break.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into that a bit later, but it's definitely nice to experience like a break from those structures, to like get ourselves familiar with who we are without someone else's rules imposed on us. But you were telling me before that you had some experiences that other people shared that you ended up having a lot of guilt over when it came to your father's deployment.
Yes, that was a hard one. So that was after 9/11. My dad, who's full-time active duty Air Force, was deployed for a period of about 9 months. I was 12 and 13, had a birthday while he was gone, and that was difficult for me to navigate, to try to figure out how to understand my own emotions. I mean, I was 12 and 13, so like that's hard already.
Right.
But I was surrounded by this community where I was definitely not the only one going through that. So I kind of had to fall back and ask myself the same question I always ask, like, okay, what are the rules here? How are my peers handling their dads being deployed? How is mom handling dad being deployed? And it was very much that this was normal, okay, acceptable. It was a big deal, but we didn't express any negative emotions about it. We might recognize that there was some deep-seated fear, but we didn't talk about it. We didn't share that. We had to put on a brave face. We had to be strong. And that's what everyone was doing. And so that's what I did too.
Do you feel like you spent time kind of like minimalizing that stress just to kind of get by?
Definitely, especially when we received news that some friends' dads weren't coming home. My concerns about my dad, who was still alive, I felt like became very minimal, and I needed to keep them under control.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very stoic practice that you shouldn't worry about things that are beyond your control, because we suffer most in our mind rather in reality. The idea of losing your father is terrible. Like living in that, worrying about that, and it's not diminishing the fact that if your father, didn't make it through, that wouldn't be awful as well. But like if you spent all that time worrying and feeling that way and still lost him, like there's a lot more pain there than you needed to experience,
And definitely. And I appreciate you saying that. That's been something I've been trying to work through now as an adult. I didn't address it for so long. That wasn't just a 12-year-old, 13-year-old experience. That's what I did in the moment, but I never went back to it. But it was a very scary time.
Right.
We didn't even know where he was in the world.
Right.
That was a secret location. That was terrifying as a kid.
I'm definitely glad that he made it and he came back. But during this whole experience in your childhood, talking about how to cope with things, you eventually created what you like to call the Museum of Emotions. Explain that.
Yes. Oh, my Museum of Emotions is a very special place. I've been very fortunate to be in a position to go to therapy, and that was a topic that we covered and how I kind of explained it to my therapist. And the way it works for me is if I go through a difficult or even a traumatic experience, of which I think this would qualify, like when my dad was deployed, that brings up a lot of emotions. And what my brain does, what an inner part of me does, I call it the curator. My curator appears and collects all of these emotions and puts them into nice, organized boxes, clear boxes, and they're appropriately labeled, and I can access the Museum of Emotions, of course, and see behind glass all of the emotions that I experienced at this time. But we just look at them. We just read off the list of what was felt. We don't sit with that. We definitely don't touch any of it. But it's a way that I coped with it, particularly what I felt were negative emotions of fear or loss or guilt or shame.
Right. No, it's understandable. In a way, it's a seemingly healthier way of bottling things up, you know?
And in the short term, it's not necessarily a bad thing. If this is a technique I was informed by my therapist, a lot of first responders will use. You arrive on the scene, you need to handle the immediate situation, and this allows you to do that. But it's probably a little unhealthy to leave everything in those boxes forever, right? Untouched, unprocessed, just stored away. That part's not the best.
No, of course. I definitely can't say that, like, putting things away and storing them, especially traumatic experiences, in the long run can ever really be healthy. Which, again, therapy can help greatly with. But there's definitely something to be said about the prolonged effects on somebody's spirit of holding on to those things. But this is your experience growing up, and I find it really interesting that you have both, like, a seemingly solid family foundation. You've got a community that you're, like, consistently a part of, but at the same time you are moving from place to place and meeting new people, saying a lot of goodbyes. How do you feel that you have relationships with other people nowadays?
That's an interesting question. So for me, my relationships now are critical. I make friends very fast. I don't know how not to. I will exist in the small talk phase for a bit, but then I want to connect. I want to talk about deeper things. And I form very strong connections with people. But almost offsetting that is how easy it is for me to say goodbye, to just completely move on from a relationship. And that's been a hard thing for me to observe about myself and try to reconcile a little bit as an adult, especially as an adult who's trying now to form some of these connections and relationships and keep them long term, which is almost a foreign concept to me, to have people in my life, to have friends for more than 5 years.
Wow. Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't think that I've known somebody in my life that forms bonds that they want to keep, but then can't keep them. I more or less find a lot of people finding it difficult just to have that connection and to form those bonds to begin with. But, like, when they find them, like, that's there for life.
I think it's just how I'm a little stubborn. I refuse to be alone.
That's fair. So yeah, we'll get into talking about, like, the next step, because I know that talking about those relationships is a huge part of your growth experience. So after you finished school, you went to Bible college to become a youth pastor and eventually met the man that you would marry. Talk about that experience.
Yes, so we both grew up in a very similar fashion. He was also an Air Force brat. We actually knew each other in high school and were dating at that time, and then both ended up going to Bible college to pursue youth ministry, which is something that I continue to pursue, but it was just so deeply ingrained in both of our lives, that mutual connection of the military kid space and understanding that life, and then the strong connection with religion, with Christianity, and how that was very intertwined.
Right.
And there's a lot of pressure.
Definitely. Always.
Yes.
Gotta follow all the rules.
Yes, which I was very good at.
Yeah, and speaking of, when you were going to college, you expressed that you had difficulties with that. And again, this is coming back from that conversation about having experienced public, private, and homeschooling. But then you went to college and all of a sudden are having these issues with how that rule system worked.
That was a huge struggle for me, to go from being homeschooled, where I had a taste of controlling my own day and schedule and education, where I became very comfortable and happy and proficient, to going to Bible college, which I quickly realized was really just Bible camp and I did not want to be treated that way. I wanted to be an adult, making my own decisions, in command of my own class schedule, time. I was working at the same time as going to school and trying to balance my schedule around that, and it did not, that alone did not fit the mold.
Right. I mean, in its own way, college, a part of what college experience is really good for is helping young people kind of be able to set up that scheduling, that life balance that you had already gotten a hand of during your homeschooling days.
Yeah, that was hard, and it was very difficult then to have to be told that I was graded on just physically being present in a class.
Yeah, that's very demeaning.
Yeah, I was like, I'm not a captive audience. And it was difficult for me too. I struggled because a lot of the classes I attended were very centered around that study of the Bible and religion and things like that. And a lot of the professors either were also pastors at the same time or had been pastors at some point. And so there was a lot of preaching. I felt like I was in church constantly.
Oof. Ow. Yeah, no. The inner child in me would be screaming at the idea.
It was very frustrating.
No doubt.
To me.
I mean, you should be there to study things, like study a book, as college does, but to have people kind of preaching to what that book is saying it doesn't allow you to do the work on your own.
Yeah, and it also didn't speak to my motivation. I didn't want to go to college to talk about the Bible. Bible was fine. I mean, I wasn't necessarily opposed at that time. What I wanted to do was help people. And we didn't ever talk about that.
Yeah. Which it's a really big problem in the religious community, is like there's a very keen sense for people to go back to that community for things like mental health. And they readily offer it as a form of therapy. But for the most part, these people aren't licensed therapists. They're not like taught through schooling about like psychology and all of these other things that are pertinent to being a professional therapist. And there's just like a lot of advice that is given traditionally versus educated. Ends up being sometimes a lot more damaging than actually helpful.
I completely agree with that and have definitely seen some of those effects. But the disconnect to me was unreal, which is amazing because I was still, at that age, very entrenched in evangelicalism. I was a believer, right? But even then, I was very frustrated with the institute of the university, and how actively I felt like they weren't interested in in helping other people. I had an experience. I did work as a youth pastor while I was going to Bible college for a time. And one of the teens in our youth group was in a terrible car accident one day. And we found out about it on the way to class. And so we found out what hospital he was in, and I popped my head into the class to tell my professor, who was teaching a Christian education course, that I would not be attending class today. Here's why. Could we say a prayer for the student? I'm on my way now to be with the family at the hospital. And the professor let me know that I had already missed too many classes that semester, and I would be docked an entire letter grade if I skipped their class.
That is
to do that.
That is asinine. Wow.
It blew my mind. I didn't know what to say. I remember I just left. I forgot about the prayer. I'm like, well, I have to go. I'm actually kind of proud of myself looking back that I didn't apologize.
Yeah, seriously.
I just left.
Get on
well,
you.
I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go be with the family. I'm not going to sit here for your lecture right now.
Absolutely. And so you were saying that you actually did some work as a youth pastor while you were going to college, and also that your boyfriend dropped out. How do you think that kind of affected things for what was to come?
That was difficult in a lot of different ways. It spoke to me at the time as maybe that's just not what God wanted for him, right? Is how we justified it at the time. But he was already starting to just feel very pressured and start to break under that pressure, to be a certain way, to follow a certain path, to make certain choices that he was not happy making for himself. And how I dealt with that was to just put more on me.
That's unfortunate. I can understand, like, you doing the thing that he was going to do before like, he had a change of heart. There's probably, like, a point of resentment there, but it kind of highlights the idea that he knew he was searching for something else. You guys eventually got married, and moved in together, and were having, like, financial problems in that space. The way that you were talking to me about it made it seem like you were having, like, a bit more financial success than he was, and it was something that also weighed on him.
That did happen eventually. So after we were married, we were so poor. We were living in the middle of nowhere, Missouri, and just trying to figure out how to do that as two 20-year-olds who had never experienced poverty before. Neither of us knew what to do. Yeah, that was a rough one.
Did you guys ever get so bad it was like, yeah, we're going to have struggle for dinner?
I learned what it meant to have sleep for dinner. Yeah.
Nice.
I never told my mom. That was something I didn't know how to express to her. It would have been admitting failure of some kind. Like, the decision to get married might not have been the right thing, but it had to be the right thing because that's what I was supposed to do if I was following the rules. So it just felt like this crazy cycle of... And I always chalked it up to, like, you know what, this is just my struggle. And if I just go through enough of a struggle right now for Jesus, then it'll be okay later.
So what were some of the factors that were, like, really pushing on you through this financial struggle?
A lot of it was just the time commitment to both go to school, to continue ministry, and uphold the ministry work I was actively in, because I was just so dedicated to that idea and driven by wanting to help people and determined to do that in some way, even though I didn't feel like my education was necessarily supporting that. It's what I had to go through in order to truly help people. But it was tough because it was hard for me. At first, I didn't have outside work. And then we ended up moving, and we moved in with my parents. We moved to Washington State.
Right.
And we're trying to find our way there. And at one point, I had 3 jobs while my husband was struggling to figure out what he was going to do since he dropped out of college.
Right.
And that definitely was something I could tell was a source of resentment for us, for him.
Right.
That I didn't know what to do about. So like, well, you want to put food on the table and pay rent? Then here we are.
Right. I mean, it's definitely one of the effects that can happen when you are in depression is like slinking into a corner that's just kind of like dark, unproductive, and the guilt that you experience over that and the resentment that can come up watching somebody else like take care of you. Like there's a lot of inward anger that can exist in that space. What kind of issues were you experiencing in that relationship when you guys eventually moved back with your parents?
Well, it was hard. The biggest thing for me is I felt like there was just so much distance, which confused me because, again, I was following the recipe of being a good Christian wife and doing everything that you were supposed to do. Even though I was such an oddball, I was going to a Southern Baptist university. They do not believe in ordaining women, but I was doing it. And I believed that women leadership was God ordained in the church. But I don't know if I believed that at the time in marriage. I talked like I did, but I didn't act that way.
Right.
I did so much craving that connection with my husband. I felt desperate after a couple of years of feeling like he was just so far away, and getting farther all the time, and I couldn't explain it. And I didn't understand. And so because he wouldn't share with me, then the only thing I could direct my focus to was that it was some failure on my part. So I would just double down on the good Christian wife routine.
Yeah, you were telling me that eventually he told you that he never really loved you, and like that hurts a lot. And do you feel that you came back with your museum of emotions and your rules to kind of like cope with that feeling and try to fix it?
Instantly. That night was very difficult. I eventually, if being a good Christian wife wasn't good enough, wasn't getting me some kind of connection that I wanted, I learned that I could push his buttons. And we had a big fight one night, and he broke down to the point that he told me tearfully, he wasn't angry anymore. He was devastated. He was hurt. He was depressed. He told me that he had never really loved me, not the way a husband should love a wife. And my first response in seeing him in that kind of distress was to shove all of my emotions in a box and try to navigate this with him.
So you said, that you were like working really hard to be that good Christian wife, just to kind of make him fall back in love with you, or like fall in love with you again,
Desperately, because it was interesting the way it happened. For about 24 hours after that initial conversation, our plan was to get a divorce, that the marriage wasn't going to last, that wasn't the marriage we wanted, that's not what either of us wanted in life. I went to my parents' house, took our dog, and told them everything that happened. And then about 24 hours later, after he had gone back and talked to his parents, and for reference, he's the son of a pastor, son of a pastor, son of a pastor. Not an exaggeration. The pressure was real.
Yeah.
And that was not an acceptable decision.
Oh, of course
That's not what we were supposed to do. That broke all of the rules. And so he came back and then told me what he was supposed to say in that situation, which is, we would see a counselor, we would figure it out. He was so sorry. He would work on it. He really did love me. He really wanted it. Let's have kids. That definitely came up. And I wish, looking back, knowing what I know now, right, that I'd held my ground.
Right.
But I did love him. I wasn't the one who had been hiding that
Right.
or burying that.
And
And so,
it definitely didn't help that you had all those rules on your side to make you be doing the right thing, you know?
it was probably one of the first times, though, that I questioned it. I remember moments where I was like, you know what, I don't have to go back. But at that time I did. We were separated for about a month. I lived with my parents, and then I insisted on a new apartment. I was not going to go back to the place where he told me he didn't love me anymore.
Right.
But we were together for about another year.
Right. At which point things happened that really, really escalated the failure of the relationship.
Yes. I caught him cheating on me. So that was kind of the final straw. And I remember, and I believe I told you this in our initial conversation, when I found that out, the first thing I felt actually wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness, it was relief.
Yeah.
Because the rules said I could leave now.
Right. Exactly.
It's finally justified.
It's odd because this happens to a lot of people in their relationships. It's like they'll have this really toxic relationship and people will be like working really hard to make it work out, but sometimes it's just not meant to be, for a lack of a better way of saying it. Like two people can love each other but not be compatible, and so it's difficult for people to I guess nut up and cut things off without that really big reason. So you'll have people go out and have an affair or cheat so that there's a big enough reason to finally cut it off.
Yes, and to minimize risk on their own side. Looking back, I didn't understand this at the time. And I eventually did struggle with having to work through a lot of anger and a lot of pain and sadness, even though my first response was relief. But the risks that he had, if he had been the one to end it, he risked his family connections on a lot of different levels, on a community that he had. And as another military kid, I wish I'd been more understanding of that. The church was our community. No matter where you went, you could take it with you. And that's what made it so powerful for us.
Right.
But
that is
he
definitely
would have lost that.
that is definitely something that I find is really lackluster in the Christian community. Is like a man can go and cheat on his wife and the relationship can end in divorce, but there's still this overlying idea that it was the woman's responsibility to keep her husband happy, and it's not his fault that he went out and did the man thing. And no matter which way you cut it, it usually does try and put pressure and fault back on the wife in the relationship. Like if a wife was to go out and cheat, she would be ostracized from that community immediately.
Instantly.
But when your husband did it, he was not at fault for the breaking of the relationship because you are the one that decided to have the divorce.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what happened to me. I did receive some support. My entire community didn't necessarily turn on me, but overall, the rules were that even though I justified it to myself, because I was still at this time kind of on the line there of being a believer, but I lost support because it did come down to me. I was the one who said I was done. He did come back again, even after I caught him cheating, and I confronted him with it to say that he didn't want to end the marriage. And that was really him following the rules.
Yeah,
that's what he was supposed to say.
Appeasing the powers that be.
And it was a big moment for me because I remember very clearly, I was like, all right, you want a bad guy? Watch this.
Right. And you actually took that experience and you left your pastoralship that you had at the church, And even like even though you made those decisions for yourself, you still had a lot of guilt over like leaving the role you had for the youths that you were, in care of.
That was almost harder for me, especially the last year of my marriage. We were never really close, but that last year, he was away so much. I caught him cheating once, but I suspect that that's probably what he was spending a lot of time doing that last year especially. So we were not close. So while that was definitely a loss, almost the bigger loss to me was walking away from what I'd been trying to build as a youth pastor, which was driven by a desire to help teens. And to leave that, it felt like losing everything. The only thing I felt like I didn't lose were some friendships and my family.
Which that is still a blessing in its own right. I know, like, being entrenched in the religious community, if you do something like that, there will be people that immediately stand up and ostracize you. And unfortunately, the people that stick by you then become these middlemen, where the people that chose to kick you out are like constantly judging the people who are connected to you for still being connected to you.
Yeah, the guilt by association almost. It's very real. And it was fascinating to experience and interesting to look back on, especially to peel back just the layers, because there definitely was a group, like you said, that outright did the thing where they needed to let me know where I was wrong as a form of holding me accountable as a sister in Christ.
Right.
Which is really just a mask for telling you that you're wrong. It's a total power play.
Yes, absolutely.
But I almost, that was easier for me to deal with than another group of people in the church who were just more passive, but basically said the same thing. They stood by the church and their decisions and everything with that, and their beliefs on marriage. There's a lot of conversation about beliefs on marriage during this time in my life with many of my friends and within my connections within the church.
Right.
But the group of people who were more passive about it was actually more painful, because I couldn't tell.
Yeah, it's really hard to
if
figure
they were
out.
With me or not.
Really hard to figure out who you can trust. And it's definitely, I can understand that it comes out of a space of self-preservation for them as well, because they themselves have to weigh their relationship with you over the relationship they have with an entire community.
Definitely.
But so a nice clean slate, if you will, to bring about the next chapter of your life. You spent a lot of the next time, like, just doing personal growth and development. You had a lot of your own views that had changed, which eventually led to a bit of a shift in your relationship with your own family.
It did, and that shift was, I feel like it happened faster than it probably did, but I just didn't stop. I had that moment of, you think I'm the bad guy, then watch this, and I left that marriage, and eventually it led me to really leaving the church. And I just didn't slow down. I didn't stop, and I kept holding up ideas, a lot of things that I was taught in the church, and actively, for the first time, truly challenging them for real.
Nice.
I had done some of it quietly, secretly,
Right.
carefully before, but I had nothing to lose anymore, or so I thought. And so I changed my stance on a lot of things. A lot of things. And I officially moved very far away then from evangelicalism, and I'm glad for that. It definitely took a toll on my relationship with my parents, however, who have remained in that belief system.
Right. How do you currently cope with that?
I try really hard to find things because I crave that connection with them. We were
Yeah.
close. And it's this ebb and flow that I'm still uncomfortable with, but I try to find things that aren't religion or politics to connect on,
Right?
which apparently we're terrible at because we would talk about those things all the time.
All the time.
And now that turns into this fight that I don't want to have because I want to be able to find a way to be at peace with them and have them in my life and accept where they're at, because that's what I would ask from them. I want them to accept me and where I'm at now. So I'm trying to extend the same thing, but it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
I
Really
can only
is.
talk about the weather for so long.
Oh my God! Yeah, no, it is quite obnoxious. Small talk is definitely not something I'm very good at either, and I didn't grow up in a military setting, but we were so Christian conservative it was like a military setting. It was very oppressive, but a lot of the conversations that we had was like how the world is wrong and should be run in this way or that way, and it was all based on politics and religion. And
Oh yeah, I can't have the hell in a handbasket conversation.
oh my
anymore.
God.
I can't.
Did
like,
you have to bring that phrase up? Like,
I'm sorry.
it's just like
I like that TV show, Mom. I think it's great.
chapters of my life just flashed before my eyes. I can't even. Please.
That was such a great go-to, though. How terrible is the public education system? They don't even allow prayer. Oh my God.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
The
I used to be able to
irony-
get out of trouble by bringing up some of those topics. If my parents caught me, or if they were mad at me in some way, if I brought one of those things up, I could get out of it because then we would redirect their focus very quickly.
Right. It's so ironic, like when you look back at a lot of things and a lot of views, because they themselves are like really, I don't know, hypocritical and self-defeating. Like, there's this fun nationalistic patriotic belief that Christians have that's like, okay, we believe in the separation of church and state really strongly, and yet they are still butthurt that Bibles aren't something that are taught in schools. And
Yeah.
it's
Like, pick one.
yeah, right. so I don't know, it's this really weird and long drawn out process of deconstructing a lot of those beliefs. Now, people like us that had our doubts and like think about it in private have a bit of a foot up from some people that never questioned it until the roof caved in on their heads. But it still takes a long time.
It does, and it was difficult. It's definitely not an easy thing, but I'm grateful that I had the opportunity to do so, to feel free enough to do so, because I'd passed the point of no return. I was a divorced woman.
Right. And you still like during this time period took a lot of responsibility for the failure of the first marriage. Failure in quotations,
Yeah, I definitely did. I struggled with that. That was a carousel that was round and round, where I would logic myself out of it, and I would understand that I didn't make him cheat on me. That's a ridiculous concept. I couldn't do that.
Right.
But it was difficult because what I sought was control of my own life, and I couldn't control him. So if it was my fault, then it was within my control to maybe examine and atone.
That definitely hits me real strong. Thanks.
You're welcome.
So despite that experience that you had, you did eventually fall in love with somebody else.
I did, because I refused to be alone.
And you're a glutton for punishment, apparently.
Apparently? Oh, goodness, yes. I had, during that time, leaned on a lot of friends and family, and I had this wonderful friend, and we were just talking, and then we just were talking a lot. And they lived back east, and I ended up just kind of admitting to them, we admitted to each other that we had caught feelings, and it snowballed from there, and it felt so good to get swept up in something that felt so good.
Yeah, yeah, of course. And you were telling me like that experience being being with them, it was about like 5 years or so, that relationship was really very healthy, right?
In so many ways, it really was. And in so many ways, it was everything my first relationship wasn't. We talked, we shared with each other, we were close, we actually had a friendship. I didn't have to follow a certain rule set with them. There weren't things that I didn't have to toe this line, right, of being the good Christian wife anymore, because they didn't care about that. It was very, very freeing. Oh my goodness, this is gonna sound ridiculous. I could fucking swear. I could do that. I could do that without consequence, without judgment, and I found out it's kind of fun.
Yeah.
I haven't really looked back.
Nice. Good on you. Looks good on you.
I don't regret that at all.
But yeah, you were saying that it was a really great relationship. There was a lot there that was really different and healthy for you, but there ended up being this really unforeseen issue that to be quite honest, when you were talking about it, I felt like you dealt with in a very, very healthy way.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I definitely had moments, but yes, so the situation that unfolded that you're referring to is in my marriage, my second marriage here. I did find happiness. I found this friend. I found this partner. However, there's a moment, it was over a year ago now, when they realized a truth about them. And they came out as a transgender woman, which drastically changed the nature of our relationship.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on how people in the LGBTQ community conduct their relationships, but if you are already in a relationship with somebody, when you're discovering things about yourself, it changes those dynamics. It makes it, extremely difficult, especially when it comes to the process of really figuring out your own identity, because you're still clinging on to this relationship that you had previously.
Yes, it was. Yes. And one of the reasons I didn't see this coming is because this marriage, my second marriage, this person hadn't been raised in religion the way I had. And for some reason, I thought that meant that they didn't have the same pressures. And maybe they didn't have the same pressures, but they still had pressure that existed.
Right.
And that's something that I wish I had better understanding of. I don't think I would have made different decisions necessarily, but I wish I had understood that better.
Yeah.
But that was one of the things that kept them in that denial space for so long.
Yeah. Unfortunately, you cannot separate Western civilization from its Christian roots and background. A lot of societal pressures come out from those very old traditional beliefs. The husband and wife, family environment is very much so Christian traditional.
Yes.
So those things still linger in society, and it's a very big pressure against the LGBTQ community in its entirety, as they're fighting for the sanctity of marriage, whilst also simultaneously, that very hypocritical thing where you have these pastors that are being convicted of pedophilia. You've got all of this cheating and affairs in the church, and divorces and such, and it's like, well, maybe your standards of what the sanctity of marriage really is, maybe that's really not healthy for people.
Yeah, maybe you're not as good at this as you thought you were. Yeah.
So during this time with your second marriage, you both eventually wound up going to therapy to help kind of figure out their identity, while kind of moving closer and closer to the idea of just kind of like moving, to have a clean slate, so they didn't have those connections and those other relationships and those expectations to be who they used to be?
That was definitely a journey. And it's interesting because it's almost easier to talk about in that sense, because looking back, it's so easy to define what occurred. But in the moment, it felt much more confusing about what was happening.
Oh, I'm sure.
Initially, my partner wasn't completely aware of what this meant for her. And so that was what drove going to therapy. We both could sense that something was happening and that was big and it was potentially relationship changing.
Right.
And I'm very grateful for so many things. One, going to therapy was a smart play. The concept there being for them to be able to work through some of these questions and feelings and search their identity. And for me, it was, this is a big thing. I don't want to burden all my friends with this is a big one. I could use an assist here of trying to navigate this, not only to protect my own mental health, but to be able, I was very interested, and the first 6 months practically of my therapy, I was very focused on trying to support my partner the best I could to figure out what this meant.
Right.
And what I could do.
And this kind of like circles back to this practice that you've done your whole life, because that experience that both of you went through was an experience for both of you. While there's obviously a lot of things that your partner needed to focus on at the time, you yourself were having to deal with the changes in the dynamic of the relationship and everything too. But you just like continued to minimalize the importance of your own stuff to, be the best support you could be for your partner.
Definitely. Because, I mean, what did I have to talk about, right? I wasn't the one experiencing an identity crisis, so my problems were so little in comparison. And my attitude was definitely, what do we need to do to get you through this?
So one of the things that you kind of said a little bit there is like how you didn't want this to be a burden on your friends either. And that's definitely a huge thing for people who like to have these big conversations with their friends, is like when you're going through it can be borderline obsessive that you reach out to friends and talk to them about these big things so that you can get like the support that you feel you need, whilst not really recognizing at the time that that's what you're doing.
Yes, and that was something I'm grateful that I had a little bit of an awareness of. It definitely hit me. My work was affected because I thought about it constantly. It was constantly in my mind, and I'm grateful I have some very close girlfriends who I love dearly, who were 100% there for me through this. But I asked a lot of them at times, and I'm grateful that I had my therapist, because there's a few moments where one friend in particular, who I'm grateful she did this in a very gentle, loving way, let me know like, hey, this is probably something to take to your therapist. I can listen to an extent. And she set some boundaries with me that probably saved our friendship. Yeah. Boundary setting is really important for healthy relationships, whether it's romantic or otherwise. So you've gone through all that and currently still in therapy, right? Yes, which is good. I definitely thought I was fast tracking it. It's like, all right, because I like to win. I'm a very competitive person. Yeah, no, same. Very much the same. I'm like, all right, here's the plan. I'm going to go to therapy. I'm going to help my partner get through this identity crisis, whatever that looks like. And then at the same time, maybe I'll work through some things that I'm going through, and then we'll be done. Yeah. Easy peasy. Like, I can do both. I can do it all. I can do everything and be done in like 6 months. Is 6 months cool? Okay. Yeah. I mean, there's an interesting thing in therapy. There's this idea for some reason that
therapy solves the problems, and that once you're done with it, all your problems are solved. But that's you end up learning that yes, there are some things that you can get through or get over, but there's also some things that are baked in. And much like an alcoholic has to spend the rest of their life like staying away from alcohol, there's things that we, for our mental health, constantly have to keep in check. It's a difficult time, but very well worth the ride.
It's hard. I had no idea that therapy would be actual work. I thought I would just show up. It was just an appointment that you would keep in my mind, right? I'm just gonna
That's
go.
the
I'm
rules.
gonna talk to somebody. Yeah, follow exactly the rules. Like, this is great. I'm gonna be so good at this.
Yeah.
But I'm so grateful for that experience. It's been really beneficial, and it's also helped in large part. Not only has it retained my friendships, but I'm so grateful. So my first divorce was ugly. It was ugly. It was not fun because he had to fight me, right? He had to follow those rules.
Yeah.
I was the deviant. I was the one. I was the bad guy.
Right.
And so it was ugly. My second divorce is painful. It was hard to lose that relationship, our marriage. But I've retained the friendship. We talk all the time. I'm so grateful to have been able to keep that. And I think a large reason I was able to keep it is because of the focus I've given to my own mental health.
Right. And it's like that relationship that you guys had was healthy, and you guys didn't break it up over some wrongdoing or any like misgivings. It was just kind of a natural part of that process. So like there's a lot of rare things that happened in that experience, which, whilst being hard to lose it, helps find a very redeeming catharsis.
It also was a lot easier to go through the second divorce because I took God completely out of it.
Ah, yeah. No more guilt, right?
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
It was very freeing. It was very freeing. I spent a lot of time angry after my first divorce because I did everything right and still lost it.
Right, yeah.
But in the same kind of thing, I did everything right, so to speak. I wasn't a perfect wife either time, right? But I loved this person, and I still lost the marriage. But it was a lot easier to deal with the second time, taking that shame and guilt and pressure off of myself.
Absolutely. And it's kind of like how we started this, is that we do a lot more harm and undue stress onto ourselves in our own minds more than in reality. Like that pressure that the church imposes, that those beliefs impose on people, impose a lot more stress on ourselves and our lives than is actually even there in reality. But you've managed to get through your second divorce, and like going through therapy, you're like really barrel rolling through all of this, and you've managed to find yourself kind of dating again.
I have, which has been so exciting. I actually, since the last time I talked to you, about a little over a week ago, made a trip back to see a bunch of my close friends that I've retained now for more than 5 years.
Congratulations.
A big deal to me, to go back, and I took my boyfriend with me, and my friend, my ex, was there as part of that friend group still. And that wasn't a big deal.
Nice.
Was such a big deal.
Yeah.
I'm still so grateful for it, for the friendship that I've been able to retain, but so grateful to have found a partner here now who's so supportive and understanding and has just been willing to see me for all that I've been through and just take me at that point.
Yeah, that is very, very beautiful. I'm really grateful that you've got that experience.
It's scary sometimes, but it's also
Yeah.
I have joked with him. I'm like, all right, so here we are. I don't know if I'm cursed. I don't know if you're gonna get hit by a car. I don't know what happens next.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm glad for where I'm at.
Yeah, me too.
And grateful for that.
Me too. So, with all of that being said, is there any advice that you would give to anybody that's listening?
I think two big pieces of advice. First one is really to just be true to yourself. To acknowledge if you feel hurt or if how you feel about your own identity. I had to come to terms with my own identity through this. There was definitely a period where like, oh man, maybe I am bisexual or something, or I'm a straight woman, and to come to terms with that, and that's okay to be true to yourself, and to find acceptance with that has brought me a lot of peace. There's days where I still work on that, but that being true to yourself and to support that in others has been so huge. And I think then probably the final thing is I still work on this, but I'm really trying to be less rule-centric and embrace that life is a little bit more like the Pirate's Code. It's kind of guidelines.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
That's been better for me. That approach has just been so much better than hard and fast rules.
Yes.
And that understanding has gone a long way for me.
Yeah, I kind of dropped that, just this past year myself. It's been a really it starts out feeling like a lot of chaos. It starts out like there's freedom, but there's chaos, and it's hard to really settle into it. But once you learn to get comfortable living without those things, it is life altering.
Definitely. Because, I mean, what's the worst that's going to happen? You're going to lose your husband, your job, your security, your community. Because look at that. You bounced back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As long as we got
okay.
As long as we got ourselves, we're good.
Mm-hmm. You can get through a lot.
Yeah. So I definitely want to thank you again for being here and for spending this time talking with me. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on. This was a great experience. I'm thankful for the opportunity.
You are very welcome. If you have enjoyed this podcast, I thank you for being here and thank you for your time. Feel free to leave a review, like, share, subscribe, all those good things to help keep this podcast up and going. You can also follow my link at sprucethebruce.xyz to help support me at my links. Thank you very much, and I'll see you guys again next week. Stay elevated, my friends. Elevated, my friends. Elevated, my friends. Elevated.